Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello, and welcome back to Neophytes of Narratology. My name is Steve-O, and I am joined by Jonathan Ian Mazur.
Hello.
And Scott Thurlow.
Still my name.
We are doing our TED Talk series. This is going to be an episode on Scott McCloud's TED Talk. Scott McCloud is a comic book writer. He's probably most well known for understanding comics.
Which, to be clear, is not a comic itself. It's about comics.
No, it is a comic.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
All right.
There's a whole series.
I've just been proven wrong.
There's a whole series, Understanding Comics, Making Comics, and I am blanking on the third one, but there's 3 of them. They're brilliant books.
Okay.
For anybody who's interested in the kind of how comics work, I highly suggest you read at least Understanding Comics.
Steve, I just want to make a point. You're sounding more and more like an NPR host.
That's what I'm going for.
Today we're
That's his dream.
I gotta get as much vocal fry into this as I possibly can.
All right.
He also did Zot, which was
Zot exclamation?
Zot exclamation point, which was a fun superhero comic that kind of played with conventions and things. I think it was his first comic book, and it was really good, but huge, giant book. So check it out if you're interested. I would suggest reading Understanding Comics first, and if you like it, go on to Zot and his other works. Anyway, McCloud talks a lot about his ideas as far as comic book theory goes, or even just storytelling theory goes in this talk.
I think it's definitely, before we go on, it's clearly specifically applied to comics as a medium.
It is.
A large part of it.
But I think a lot of it can be,
It's
especially the
others.
beginning part,
Sure.
can be applied to
Sure.
other storytelling
But
mediums.
it definitely has that art theory, visual,
Yes.
like imagery.
Yes.
He uses both classical kind of ways to interpret visual mediums and applies it to combines them in unique ways. And he briefly touches upon it because I believe, Steve, you mentioned that established in other works by his.
Right.
So to really give you an argument for the history of this visual medium, going back to like the Egyptian hieroglyphics and papyrus scrolls and Grecian urns, and moves to, it lightly touches upon comic books now, but is a large part about what the future of comic books might hold.
Yes.
That's true. And let's give a caveat that his talk was given in 2005, so it may seem a bit dated on some of the things he was saying, at least references to technology specifically.
Right.
But regardless, it was still a good foundation.
Yeah, and McCloud has always tried to be on the cutting edge of technology because I think that, and this comes out a lot in his talk, I think that he's really into what technology can do for art forms, specifically comics. And I think a lot of that comes out. But, he gives a whole big history of comics and what they used to be, or art in sequential form.
Yes.
And what that used to be. And he goes all the way back to, ancient Egypt. He talks a lot about right after the printing press was invented. He goes over examples of how comics came out pretty much right away, and in a very close to current, in a very close format to their current format, which I thought was kind of interesting. He talks a lot about an infinite canvas, which technology can provide us. Possibly, it's the idea that,
in theory,
a monitor, as opposed to being just another page, is actually a window to an entire world. So you can look through this window and see different parts of what's going on in this infinite canvas that he talks about.
We brought up the point that the last TED Talk we did was Anthony Stanton.
Andrew
Stanton.
Stanton.
I apologize. Andrew Stanton was kind of an introductory course to narrative this is certainly a graduate level
300
course.
Yeah, this just jumps right up. I mean, he talks about a lot of very in-depth ideas that he has as far as the art form goes, and I think that this is a TED Talk that is very interesting and probably is more of a, hey, go check out some of my ideas that are done in a larger format and in a way that I can actually, talk more about these.
Now, there's a fascinating idea with comic books that when you go back in to the Greek days, that the comic book heroes are sort of the gods that the Greeks used in their narratives.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it very fascinating. Although I'm not the biggest comic book fan, how this medium has always existed, and he makes a very compelling case to its legacy.
Yes, I agree with that.
And I kind of knew the hieroglyphic aspect of it, but to watch the development of the printing press, how these kind of linear narrative structures, visual structures developed over time, with the printing press needing to make they're not just long frescoes on the walls now, that it changed the way that you read these, that you had to jump the gap of a page now. I thought was one of the most fascinating aspects of this, because quite frankly, the technical aspects of the development to the future, not that I didn't understand them, but it was building off, again, like you said, building off of things that I wish I could have had a better understanding of prior, and or more to read about it to really grasp it as fully.
Sure, no, I agree with all that, and yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that I also enjoyed about it was there's sort of a brief history of the medium itself and how it evolved and what as sort of elements from it need to be there and how we can change them using technology that has advanced from the earliest form. And of course, yeah, like you said, like the Greek urns and so forth, like might as well have been early comic books. And I'll just shoehorn, of course, my own personal bias in that for other shows, specifically Syntax Error, that it's an emerging medium, or at least it was, even though it's sort of, his point was it sort of always existed, but technology allowed it to do different things as technology advanced a lot more.
When he was bringing up the use of computers, it kind of felt that he was suggesting that comic books will, aside from the infinite canvas in a way, a lot of what he was saying was kind of, it's going to approach more and more like movies and or Flash videos.
Yeah, you're right. I got that out of it. Yeah.
So I felt that as technology improved, the limit it approached was more towards the movie experience.
I don't know if that's really what he's going for. I think that the idea of the infinite canvas is that you can tell a comic story and it's not going to be bound by a page.
I said aside from infinite canvas.
Oh, okay.
But
I'm
the
sorry.
initial
On
point
top of that,
was
yes,
adding visual and sound to it.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right about the infinite canvas is a completely, which I've never seen yet. I've never seen a practical use of that yet.
In fact, I actually...
Well, when we can practically use infinity, then maybe you'll know.
Yeah.
But
I've actually looked up a few of these, and there's some really brilliant projects out there. And I'll find some of them and link them on this page so that the listeners can take a look at them as well.
Do your own research. Sure.
There's some really cool stuff out there that is using that in a variety of different ways, too. It's not like everything kind of just runs the same, takes the same format. Sure. What I think is great about the idea of the infinite canvas is that, or, the idea of using a monitor as a window as opposed to a page, is that you can take it in so many different directions. And some people have done it some really brilliant things with it.
I definitely agree with that. And again, that's what I sort of gravitate towards in his talk. And yes, I'll bring it back to video games, but it was an evolving use of the medium and what you can do combined with technology that allowed you to do it. So I think I took his point on that, at least, that it was somewhat of a growing pains kind of thing. It seemed good in theory to try to translate. I think he used this exact phrase, 1 for 1, the ratio of how they were comics,
right,
physical comics, and then integrate it into digital comics, but didn't quite work out the way that many people in the field and even he perhaps thought it would. But I think he goes on to one of the things on top of that I found possibly the most interesting part is seeking patterns in things as applied to storytelling in this format as a medium. I thought that was very interesting, and you could sort of see the evolution of it. And he, like, yes, I'll give him credit, and he sort of took credit for predicting some of the things that would have been done afterwards, after it went through those growing pains that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I think we're going to continue to see evolution in terms of this.
Of course, sure.
You know, as print becomes, I don't want to say print's is going to be dead.
Somewhat more relegated to the background, right. I guess.
I don't even think that, but you know, it's going to be sharing the limelight with other types of media that, you know, this is the ideas for making comics as far as even an interactive thing, or not even an interactive thing, but you know, something that can go in all directions at any time because it's not constrained to a page, is kind of a new medium.
Somewhat changes the nature of the previous one. Sure.
It's not even, you know, the strange thing about it is going back more to what the accordion, what was he saying? There were like 48 accordion bound pages, or like accordion style pages on deerskin, you know, that had images on them. It's going to be more towards something like that, as opposed to the way that comics have been since print existed, basically.
Sure.
Which is interesting that it's going back, and yet still, you know, kind of going forward.
When I go forwards, you go backwards. Somewhere they will meet, of course, but no, yeah. I mean, I
was twirling.
I get it, and I agree with that. Like that, he seemed he was getting to that point, in maybe somewhat of a circuitous way at times. But I agree with that. At the end of the day, that he seems to point again. And it goes back to like I said, the thing I liked the most about it was looking at the patterns and seeing where it's going to go, where the direction seems to point you towards in the future of this medium.
Yeah, pattern. Well, I don't want to go off on a philosopher, but observing patterns does not necessarily predict future events.
Sure, that's true, but it's helpful, at least as a guideline, I guess I want to say. And it seems that based on his knowledge and his love of this art, that he was able to do it to some extent.
Didn't you learn anything from The Big Short?
No, I learned nothing from The Big Short. Much like the banks learned nothing. But either way.
I mean, I somewhat agree with you. Yeah, well, I completely agree with you. You certainly can't predict with certainty future events based on previous patterns. But what you can do
is... I said, they could be a helpful guideline.
What you can do is, and this is kind of the way that I look at life. It's not like one or the other. It's not like you're right or you're wrong. It's, okay, you have this percentage of being right, or you have this percentage of, you know, not being right. And that's and it's helpful to develop an idea of which way to go forward.
Well, you of course, as always, are wrong.
Yes, but I had mostly. I was like 95% to be wrong anyway, so it doesn't even matter.
So this is our second one we did. So I feel obliged to make comparisons. I found it interesting what these two claimed that storytelling was about, because Stanton talked about how storytelling was pointed. It had a destination, and it was about a proper method of approaching
point
that.
B, essentially.
Yeah, where what's this?
Scott McCloud.
Scott McCloud said that storytelling was inherently escapist.
He did make that point. That's true. Yes.
So it's fascinating to me that we're listening to we listened to first a very broad aspect of storytelling, and this is very specific, but with completely different intentions in going into storytelling.
Well, I will say this: Stanton had a very specific style of storytelling, and you could tell that he has fostered that throughout his career. He has his way of doing things, and it's worked for him, and he's willing to talk about that and you know, say, here's what has worked, and here's how I have gone about writing a story. And he's not saying, you know, you have to do it this way, but he is saying, here are the guidelines that I've followed. Whereas Scott McCloud takes a far broader look at the idea of storytelling. He looks at storytelling from... I feel like Scott McCloud, and like everything I've read about him has made me feel this. He looks at storytelling from every storyteller's point of view, and he tries to take all the...
I like that. That's
all the various types of storytelling, and he even has like a chart of the 4 types of different storytellers. You know, like here is the classicist type of story. Here is the animalist type of story. Here's the iconoclast. Here's the what was the other one? Formalist type of storytelling. And you know, he Scott McCloud, his interest is not necessarily... Scott McCloud loves telling stories. I know that about him. It's not something that... I mean, you could probably get it from this, but...
He'll be on the horn pretty soon.
know. Yeah, we're going to try and get him on the horn. We'll see what happens. But, like, he loves telling stories, but his main interest is in understanding the way that stories are told. And in viewing it that way, he wants to know how everyone who has successfully written a story does it.
But it's interesting, too, that they have both had guidelines for this. And I want to talk about Scott's guidelines here, where he had mentioned kind of in a view I agree with, that learn from everyone, know the rules in a sense, and then follow no one, and break the rules where you can. So you have to first learn
where you think it's going to be interesting to do so.
Ignore in a way.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think that I've taken. So I read Making Comics very, very early in my life. Not very early, but while I was in college, maybe my sophomore year in college. So I took a lot of the way that I look at stories from him, because I think that he was the first one that
informed your.
He was the first one that I read that was like, I really was like, oh, that's I get it. And those two, quote unquote rules are really important to me. Learn from everyone and follow no one. You want to come up with your own story. You don't want to you want to be as underivative as possible, but you also have to take everyone that came before you into account, or everyone that you've learned about at least.
Sure.
Which I think is really interesting.
So he has, again, maybe this is due to the upbringing he had, but he has a very mechanical, mathematical, scientific viewpoint of how to look at things,
yes.
very logical
which I very much appreciate.
I appreciate that as well.
Yeah.
And you can see that informing his worldview. And perhaps that's why he's attracted to comics in a sense, because the control...
The nature of
it. Of it. So
I agree. So I'll just tie it back. I don't know much more to say, but I will call back to poetics. Right? It's basically applying a somewhat scientific method to an art form, which should seem at odds at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. But I think if you are able to do both of those, it will improve your just skills at both and make a better story and make you understand why you're making a better story.
Don't let Susan Sontag hear you saying that.
Well, she won't hear me.
Don't worry.
Anyone who does want to hear what I say about her can also look that up. But no, I enjoyed this talk. Steve-O was more familiar, like the most familiar with him as an artist, and I probably will be interested in checking out the ones you said he's actually like delved more into. Sure, like again, this was a TED Talk, so I had to find out pretty limited amount of time to go over what he wanted to say. But what he did say, I found interesting, and because I have an interest in the medium more than perhaps some of us here, I would want to check out what he actually delved more into about it.
Basically, I just want to end off on saying that, yeah, if you have any interest in comics, definitely check out McCloud's books. He delves into a lot of how they work and why they work. And it's things that you would never think of. It's a lot of things that you would never think of unless you read this book. And he has obviously put a lot of thought into what's going on with them.
And if anyone has any interest in logic and comics, I recommend Logic Comics.
Indeed.
Well, perhaps we'll talk about that one. That one was really good. But anyway, I think that's going to do it for us on this episode. So we've been talking about Scott McCloud. I am Steve-O, here with Jonathan Mezer.
Goodbye.
And Scott Thurlow.
I will now retreat into infinite canvases.
Have a good one.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Mezer.